All right. Good morning, everyone. Welcome to day two of Cannabis Innovation Lab. How's everyone doing today? Very good. That's like a mute applause. I see a lot of thumbs up. I'm very pleased to introduce our panel today, which will focus largely on cannabis rescheduling. And given the expertise of our two esteemed panelists, we might get into other regulatory battles, arguments, conversations, debates that we're seeing at the federal level around safer banking and everything else. But first and foremost, I would like to introduce each of our panelists and starting with John Sullivan at Cresco Labs. John, hello. If you can say a little bit about yourself, how you got into your position, and what you're doing today as you're based in DC. And then we'll go with Joanne Caceres as well. Then we'll get into some moderator Q&A, and then we want to open it up to interaction between the cohort as early as possible. So start typing your questions into the chat, and we'll go from there. John, good morning. Thank you.
Thank
Tell us a
you.
little bit.
Good to be here. Nice to see everybody. Appreciate everyone taking the time today. I'm John Sullivan. I'm Executive Vice President for Cresco Labs. I've been at Cresco since 2018, December of 2018. But prior to that, I guess in a prior lifetime, I was a criminal prosecutor in Chicago, Illinois. I was a gang crimes homicide prosecutor for my final 5 years in Chicago. After I did that, I left there, opened a firm, and shortly thereafter got a call from a friend of mine who's an MD and some other friends who were pharmacists, and they wanted to get into the cannabis industry. This is back in 2013 when Illinois was first writing their medical cannabis law. They wanted to get into it, and they didn't want to go to jail. Which was still a real possibility back in 2013. In fact, when I first got in, the Supreme Court of Illinois threatened to take my law license away. So things have certainly changed quite a bit since then. In any event, I wrote their applications for two medical dispensaries in Illinois. I was fortunate enough to win both of those after writing them. One was located in Rockford, Illinois, which is about 90 miles west of Chicago. And the other one was famously located 2 blocks north of a place called Wrigley Field in Chicago, and is now, we moved it to I think it's 550 feet from home plate. So it's kind of our flagship store at Cresco Labs. But I built out both of those stores. I did everything. I mean, soup to nuts, accounting, finance, construction, regulatory. I stood behind the counter and I sold cannabis for 3 years. Driving one day at Rockford, the next day at Wrigley, and I drove back and forth between those two spots. Did that for 3 years. It's a lot of hard work. Much to my family and friends' surprise, I didn't become instantly rich when I started working in the cannabis industry. Everybody thinks that money just rains down. It does not. It's actually really hard work. I'm sure all of you know, if you have ventured into this space, it is not a get-rich-quick scheme by any means. It is a lot of hard work. Did that for 3 years. Couldn't take it anymore. Wasn't making any money because of a thing called 280E, and not being able to deduct normal course of business expenses from my taxes. So I ended up merging with Cresco Labs. Like I said, that was December of 2018. Came on to run their government affairs, their legal regulatory department. At one point, I ran the real estate department. I also ran the retail department. Like cannabis, you end up in a lot of different areas that you think you would never be in. So I've got kind of I helped build out several cultivation centers. So I've got kind of a far and wide experience over the last 10 years in cannabis, but most of my work has been trying to change people's minds, especially politicians who are anti-cannabis, certainly lobbying every day about the medical benefits, about the health benefits that can come with cannabis. And that's really been my life's mission for, like I said, the last 10 years. So, and certainly I've been working on rescheduling since Joe Biden took office back in January of 21. It's been a long road, but like I like to say in politics, is pressure and time. Nothing happens quickly with the federal government. certainly ever. So it's pressure and time, and hopefully we're almost there. And I'm looking forward to having this discussion with you guys today. So thank you very much. Thanks, Brad.
Thank you, John. Joanne.
Hi, everyone. My name is Joanne. I'm a partner at a law firm named Dentons, where I am part of the cannabis group, which is really awesome because it means I do cannabis and hemp law 100% of the time, which would not have been possible even maybe 10 years ago when I first got started. Similar to John, I worked on some of those early Illinois applications, and for me, I think it was late 2014, right? 2015, John, that happened. Worked on 2 cultivation applications. It was way before people understood how ridiculously competitive those would be. I think at the submission day, there were people like farmers with bank boxes of applications, like redacting on the line because they hadn't understood what redacting was. And it was really, it was really nice and fun in those days. Yeah, you hear a lot of people say in cannabis, there's missionaries and mercenaries. I'm definitely a missionary. I'm a longtime user, which I'm really happy to say in intros now. I used to not feel comfortable saying that as a lawyer. Now I can. Was doing healthcare litigation. It was fine. It wasn't really my passion. But I was introduced to a partner who was doing cannabis law. And I remember when he was speaking to me, he said, and the firm has already accepted that they will defend us if we get charged criminally or civilly for doing this work. And that was just like the end of the selling for me. I was like, that sounds so cool. That's the coolest thing that could ever happen. Like if I was put in handcuffs for writing a cannabis application, that would have been amazing. I mean, luckily it didn't happen because it'd probably be hard if it did, but that's sort of how I got launched into the cannabis industry as a young attorney now almost 10 years ago, and was really lucky and fortunate basically 4 years ago to move over to Dentons with that partner. His name is Eric Berlin, where we now do cannabis full time, 100% of the time.
Wonderful, Joanne. So, John, you talked about, beginning your focus on rescheduling at the onset of the Biden administration. If you can get, I think everyone has a general understanding of rescheduling and where we are with Schedule 1 substance and how we're shooting for Schedule 3. But if you could talk about the political environment and what you saw and why you, Cresco, and the industry at large used this opportunity for, what we thought, I think, was a favorable administration to focus a lot of your energies on rescheduling or even descheduling cannabis.
Yeah, sure. So, I think there's a lot of enthusiasm back when Joe Biden was elected president and took office back in January of 21. I think probably there was over enthusiasm at the time. I mean, Joe Biden has spent most of his life on the Judiciary Committee in the United States Senate as a tough on drugs, especially throughout the 1990s kind of guy. I mean, it used to be to get elected as a Democrat, you had to be tough on crime and good on education, and there was otherwise you weren't getting elected. So you saw a real kind of arms race, especially throughout the 90s with cocaine, et cetera, and cannabis, quite frankly, and some of the mandatory minimums and stuff that were put in by Joe Biden and others. I think most of them regret a lot of that now. But Joe Biden also, from a political perspective, is also tough to crack because of his son, right? I think we all know when you talk to people who have people with addiction issues in their families, most of them, or a lot of them, will trace that back to starting with marijuana in high school or whatever, right? We still hear it, even though we all know the science does not support the idea of a gateway drug. It is always part of the drug story, or usually almost always part of the drug story of addiction. So to think that this president, whose son's life has been horribly impacted by addiction, would just magically all of a sudden be like, oh yeah, cannabis is fine, we should just legalize it, was a fairy tale. I know there was enthusiasm around it, but it was just not realistic. So we had to look at what is a more moderate approach with the president. I think the shine came off the idea of, legalization happening anytime quickly under Joe Biden, especially when he needs 60 votes in the United States Senate, which we're not even close to from a total legalization perspective. So it really became talking to the administration about the science behind cannabis, about the addiction science behind cannabis, about the medical benefits of cannabis, and working to convince him and the administration. Fortunately, we had a real ally in Secretary Becerra at HHS, who's from California, who had a long history with cannabis policy. So he became very helpful, but it really became a process of trying to convince the president to really let his scientists, especially with some of the new political appointees at HHS and political appointees at the DEA, to take another look. The medical benefits of cannabis are now, in my estimation, undeniable. It was a fiction that HHS and DEA have been living in a long time, that there's no medical benefit for cannabis. So it really became a consistent effort over, well, I don't know, a year and a half to convince the president and his administration to take another look at the cannabis schedule, knowing full well that he was not going to come out and support early on in his administration full legalization. I think he may in a second term. We can talk about that if people would like, but certainly was not going to get there in the first 4 years of his presidency. So fortunately, and I give the president a lot of credit on this, he stood up and ordered HHS and the DEA to look at cannabis again, which was a big shift for him emotionally, personally. But also, I always give politicians credit when they realize it's the right thing to do for the country. And he certainly did that. He didn't have to. I mean, there's, at least until recently, we've done some polling recently that shows there actually is a big upside to even rescheduling especially with youth voters, which should come as no surprise to us, but it always helps to show politicians the numbers. But he ordered that, and then, got to give HHS a lot of credit. They, and Joanne can certainly talk about this better than I can, but they looked at cannabis in a totally different way than they normally do with drug approval processes. And it's fascinating how they did it. They took state data, other things, other ways, and then gave a recommendation of Schedule 3 over to DEA, and DEA is looking at that now. But for me, it was a monumental shift in federal policy. And here's why. For the first time ever, the federal government recognized there's a medical benefit to cannabis. Now, I mean, it's absurd that it took this long, for sure. But the fact that HHS has said that now is groundbreaking, right? It legitimizes the work that so many people have done for so long, that have pushed for and shown the benefit of medical cannabis, all the risks people took, the people that were put in jail, all of that. It's groundbreaking. So that's number one. Number two, from a criminal justice perspective, while it doesn't take away a lot of the sentencing, things for weight for cannabis, blah, 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 like it's not earth-shattering in that sense, but it is earth-shattering in the sense that the federal government, HHS at least, and hopefully DEA has said that cannabis is not cocaine and cannabis is not heroin, right? It's not dangerous like those substances. And that's also earth-shattering. So the fact that we now have those two things to now build on, I've already heard from folks on Capitol Hill that, oh gosh, if the government really reschedules, then we can take a really good look at, full legalization, because now we'll have the science and the data to back up what federal policy should be. So this could be a huge step for this country. It could be a huge step for us and all of our businesses. I mean, we can talk about tax implications, et cetera, but it is groundbreaking stuff. And it's something we should all take a lot of pride in. Everybody's worked in this industry. Everybody has suffered in this industry. We are really close to having some groundbreaking stuff here. Sorry, I feel like I'm monologuing now, so I'll stop.
All good. Joanne, so I think it was August 30th, thereabouts, when it was leaked that HHS had issued a letter of recommendation of rescheduling. When did what conditions within the Biden administration, which John eloquently spoke about some of his psychological leanings, but I mean, from an administrative standpoint, what did you see, and what have you seen since the full report was released like a week and a half ago to fortify that not only is it significant that HHS has issued this recommendation, but the chances of actually getting this through DEA. I mean, talk about some of the steps that you've seen along the way.
Sure, and I'm gonna add in my own question to that question because I want to just quickly add a little bit of historical background about cannabis being Schedule 1. So cannabis was placed on Schedule 1 legislatively in the 70s, right? So I think it's really interesting and important to understand that it was placed there by legislation, not by science. And it was placed there even at the time it was known it was incorrect. It was placed there over the objection of the American Medical Association back then. Why? Because cannabis was in the American pharmacopoeia. It was used. There were tinctures, there were prescriptions. It had been used in the US for at least decades, probably longer. It had been used in ancient medicine way longer than that, right? So first things first, it was placed there legislatively. It wasn't found by science to be there. But at the same time as that law was written, there was also a process put in place for considering what schedule new drugs should be placed on. And it also did allow for what we're talking about now, which is the rescheduling of drugs as new information comes in. For cannabis, I think the potential for rescheduling for many decades was an absolute sham. It was never done seriously and it was never taken seriously. So if you look at the 2016, which was the last time it was considered, at the behest of two state governors asked for a administrative review of cannabis in 2011, based on the fact that their states had gone medical. I think it was Washington and Oregon, and the evidence that they had used to make that decision. If you were to read the FDA's opinion then versus the opinion now, it's just amazing. And John mentioned how stark the difference is, because what the FDA basically did last time was, first, they made an incredibly ridiculously high standard for what studies they would consider legitimate, finding that only 9 studies met that qualification, right? So they could only find 9 studies and about half of them were not great. Therefore, there's not enough evidence, right? And the second thing they did was that there was this documented 5-part test that a drug had to pass to be considered having medically accepted use. Except this 5-part test was based on how the FDA approves pharmaceutical drugs. And they basically created this test that there was no way cannabis could win. There was no way cannabis could beat it. It was like, it's a plant, and this was a test developed for one single chemical drug, right? So it made just absolutely no sense. And then this last historical piece of information I want to share with you to remember is that we have synthetic delta-9 THC drugs that are approved and have been approved for many decades, right? Including Marinol and Syndros, which have both been placed on, obviously, schedules lower than 1, Schedule 3 and Schedule 2. So then, of course, the FDA also had to make these ridiculous arguments that were just ridiculous about why it made sense for Marinol or Syndros to be scheduled down, but cannabis had to stay in Schedule 1. And it just, I'm sure some people thought they were doing that in good faith, but when you read it now in 2023, it just, you have to believe it's all politics, and the reasoning got filled in later. In some ways, maybe in a good way, maybe in a bad way, the new HHS decision is really similar, just in the other direction. So what they did this time is, first of all of a sudden, a bunch of studies were good enough for them to look at. They did also look at a lot of the newer studies, because there has been a lot of research in the last 5 to 10 years. But there's no mention of the 5-part test. It just disappears. It doesn't exist anymore. Now there's a 2-part test. And the 2-part test, in the same way the 5-part test was written in a way that you couldn't pass, cannabis could not fail the 2-part test. It was like, is it being medically used under the supervision of healthcare professionals? Yes. Is there some credible evidence that maybe it helps in a medical way? Yes. So it's really interesting, and this happens in law a lot and in politics a lot. The way they set up the question made the answer inevitable, right? And the way they set up the question, I think, was politically motivated. This time it broke our way, so it's great. But it did, we can talk about this later. It will open things up to challenges. But so back to the real original question, and I guess I'm guilty of long answers too right now. There were a lot of murmurings that HHS was going to come to a good decision. So that was kind of the expected industry action, but it was really exciting and groundbreaking, like John said, for that announcement to come out. The HHS has been kind of cute about it. I think they like tweeted a teaser on 4/20 last year, before they officially released the letter, which was like closer to June. All timeline guesses are kind of out the window because this has been such a unique historical moment. So when that letter came out, one of the first things we did was, let's look at the old times that letters have come out, that HHS has made these determinations, and look at how long it takes for the DEA to do its review and issue its own recommendation, which is what we're waiting for now. What we saw historically for Marinol, for Epidiolex, was that the letter would come, and then about 3 months later, the DEA would do their proposed rule. Obviously, that's already out the window, right? Because we're like on month 6. But we keep hearing these rumors. Oh, it's going to happen in October. Oh, it's going to happen in November. Oh, it's going to happen in January. So we might still have in the next 7 days an announcement from the DEA. But the reason that happens is because, as I mentioned, there's that process under the law. So the process is, first the HHS makes a recommendation as to the science of the chemical. Scientifically, where should this sit? That's their decision, and their scientific opinion is binding on the DEA. But all that really means is that the DEA, when it bases its decision, it can't disagree with the science. It can still decide to put cannabis in a different schedule based on other considerations, but they would have to say it's other considerations, not science, that is making them do it. So it could be crime or whatever else they decide. They actually have pretty wide berth. Still, kind of the rumblings again are that they will agree with the recommendation. If that does happen, what we're waiting for is for that proposed rule to come out. Most likely a proposed rule. They could go to something called a final order, but that's really unlikely. So they would make a proposed rule. We propose cannabis goes. You know, we're all hoping that they're going to say to Schedule 3. There's still some speculation that they could say Schedule 2, which would be a huge problem from a lot of what we're talking about. Once they do that, there'll be a set notice and comment period. It's usually about 90 days. And there's also the ability for any individual to request a hearing. The DEA has wide discretion whether to hold the hearing or not. So it's going to really be, I think, again, kind of a politics question, whether they decide to hold a hearing or not. If they do hold a hearing, that obviously extends that period from proposed rule to final rule, because the hearing has to happen first. Once the hearing happens, if it happens, an administrative law judge will make some sort of ruling, but then even that ruling becomes a recommendation to the DEA. At the end of the day, the DEA has the final word, and they will then issue a final rule. So, as I mentioned, historically, we looked at it. Usually when the HHS letters come out, you're talking DEA final rule 8 or 9 months later. We're already, on month 6 or something, so we're not in that usual timeline. So it's kind of up in the air. And you know, it's a really controversial issue that a lot of people are interested in. So we kind of expect that it'll be a bit of a long process. For political reasons, people do believe that the government, that the Biden administration wants it done before the election. So people are still kind of operating on the assumption that something will have happened by then.
And so, John, you know, what are the biggest operational implications? You mentioned 280E. Is that the primary win here?
That's it. Yeah. I mean, like I said, we're going to have work to do post this, especially around the criminal justice side, sentencing side. There's been a lot of anti-cannabis legislation over the years that outside of the CSA that have added penalties just based on weight of marijuana, not based on what schedule marijuana is on. So we're going to have to do a lot of work around that. And maybe Joanne can opine on this, but so Senator Grassley, last year, put a research bill in so that more cannabis, it was actually a horrible bill. It actually makes cannabis research tougher, which is hard to believe because they all took credit for it. Normally going to Schedule 3 would open the opportunity for more research around cannabis, and I think it probably still does to some degree, but that piece of legislation that's hanging out there makes that more difficult. So really, for me, it's 280E is huge, but like I said too, from a prosecutor perspective, from a criminal justice perspective, the prosecutors are just going to look at cannabis differently, right? It's not heroin anymore. It's not cocaine anymore. It's what's on Schedule 3, Joanne? Testosterone or something like, how many testosterone prosecutions have you seen over the years, right? So
Tylenol with codeine is on Schedule 3.
yeah,
So,
there hasn't been a whole lot of Tylenol with codeine prosecutions either. You can be, don't get me wrong, right? Though you can still be prosecuted for those things. But it's just, it changes the mentality of the country. And like I said, for me, the biggest upside, I think it actually makes safe banking passing easier. I've heard from Republicans that are like, oh shit, well, if HHS comes out and says, it's okay, and science says it's okay, and then maybe we can vote to start helping cannabis businesses out more. So yeah, other than but other than the 280 implication, that's really that's the sum and substance of how it impacts the business.
And on 280, Joanne, if you could talk a little bit about, the ability to write off taxes for, general business practices and how significant that is to your clients in terms of, their operational viability right now, because cannabis is such a difficult, as John said earlier, industry in which to make money right now.
yeah. So 280E is a very worrisome 2-sentence part of the tax code. And it basically just says if your business is in trafficking in Schedule 1 or 2 drugs, you cannot take normal business deductions. Any of you who have run businesses should know that that is huge, right? You can't deduct marketing. You can't deduct, I don't know, all the other things that you do for your business that you usually can deduct, you can't. So for, a sole dispensary proprietor, for example, I've heard that sometimes your effective tax rate can be as high as 70 to 90%, right? A lot of the big companies, right, have figured out kind of different ways to structure it so that they can keep more of their money, because you can still take certain deductions. There's cost of goods sold. And the more you can kind of shift into cost of goods sold, and the more, purely legal non-trafficking activities you can move to other entities, there are ways to kind of try to minimize the impact of 280E, but it's always going to still be there as long as we're in Schedule 1 or 2. So that's going to be just so tremendous. Right now, what we're seeing a lot in the industry is, obviously there was a lot of optimism, let's say back in 2019. I'm pretty sure I'm on the record publicly saying we're going to have descheduling in 21, right? It seemed totally possible that was going to happen then. So we go from that optimism to the pandemic, which was actually not so terrible for cannabis companies, but was still the pandemic and terrible for everyone, to this now really elongated view, maybe a more realistic view from the beginning of when we're going to have true descheduling, right? It's not going to be in 25, maybe it's going to be in 30 now, is what I hear most people talking about. So what really happened is, it's like the investors got tired of waiting. I think as most of it, right? Like a lot of people got in early thinking it's going to be tough, but then legalization will happen and there'll be this huge boom. And now people are kind of tired of waiting. And then people who are the true believers are out of money to put in, or are putting their money in other places. And there's still a long way to go, right? So everyone's kind of hunkered down and having to conserve their cash as much as possible and be really efficient, which are all good practices to have, but to have that 280E relief and to just automatically kind of get this huge pot of money back, or be able to, make better decisions because you are going to get those business deductions, it's going to be really interesting to see people's marketing budgets explode, right? People's ability to improve. I think the big one I've really heard is that there's so much technology that they could use to improve and make their facilities more efficient, but they just don't have the capital now to do it, right? Or they don't have people willing to finance that right now. Whereas once their bottom lines start looking a lot better with 280E gone, they'll be able to put in those investments. So hopefully we're seeing just better all around, right? So more efficient operations, better products, better brands.
Yeah, I mean,
Yeah,
yeah, I mean, just not to cut you off, but I mean, listen, it changes the whole dynamic. We become a real industry. I mean, writ large across the country. Like, I mean, everybody, I mean, if you've been paying your taxes or paying 70 to 90%, I mean, if you listen to Boris Jordan yesterday, he was on Bloomberg, the president of and founder of Curaleaf. His company is not profitable. Really, none of us are. I mean, GTI arguably made a couple $1,000,000 last year, but it's all because of the federal tax code. Boris Jordan said on that interview yesterday, it's the difference between $200 million for his company. So imagine you have a company that is not profitable one day, and the next day you're dropping $200 million to the bottom line. Now that, I mean, he is the biggest cannabis company in the country, in the world probably, because they're in 4 other countries, I think. But for a Cresco Labs, you know, it's probably somewhere in the neighborhood of 120 to $130 million. For, you know, myself, when I ran my independent dispensaries, you know, is probably the difference between 4 or 5 or $6 million, even back in the medical days, right? Like, so you actually become profitable. You can reinvest in your business. You can apply for other licenses. You can hire more people. You can bring in more product. Like, it will change the world. And like for me, I'm excited because we'll actually be able to lobby federally. Like, we don't even play in the game that big pharma and big alcohol plays in, right? They spend hundreds of millions of dollars in the federal government every year. We don't do that as a cannabis industry. You want to know why things don't change quicker? I mean, they still wouldn't change quickly, but why they don't change quicker? It's because we don't lobby. We don't lobby for real. We don't lobby with a lot of money, which is what makes the world go around in Washington, D.C. I hate to be a total pessimist. And for the record, I would say they're not all transactional. It's not always about money, but if you want to get in the room, you want to have a voice, you have to invest a lot of money in Washington, D.C., and we'll actually give the cannabis world the opportunity to do that as well.
Well, that's because you talked about Biden administration coming in and there being optimism, and you know, up until I would say April of 2022, it was relatively easy to raise capital in cannabis, and over the course of the last 20 months, it's been at a standstill, as we know. Starting with John, I mean, do you know of quote unquote kind of curious investors out there on the institutional side that would be investing in cannabis and they're just waiting for an accelerant like 280E?
Oh, for sure. I mean, listen, everybody feels like they got burned, right? It used to be cannabis was very much a tell me story, like, hey, we're going to open this facility, we're going to make X amount of dollars, our revenue is going to be great, right? Investors back in 18, 19, you know, that era were like dumping money in because they thought the upside was there. Like Joanne said, like they thought for sure federal policy was going to change, like ton of money. And now it's like, oh, all that money's gone away. And the common investors, like, I'm not in a tell me mood anymore. Like, you guys could go in and make the best pitch to most investors right now about how you're going to have the best cannabis facility and how you're going to have these great returns. And they're like, yeah, somebody's going to have to show me something first. So really the other side of that is 280E going away is a show me. It shows that there is actual federal movement. I think most of cannabis investment died at the end of last year when safe banking failed to pass once again. We thought we had it. The rug got pulled out right at the end by Senator McConnell, Senator Toomey, some others, which was just devastating to most investors, right? They were looking for that shot in the arm. It didn't happen. So this is the shot in the arm. This is the tell me or show me rather than tell me moment that I think will, I mean, investors will be able to see a return. Like, if you can't get money out of your investment because the federal government takes it all, it's not a smart investment, right? It becomes a smart investment if you can actually see a path to a return. And that's what this will do for companies, like I said, writ large across the country in cannabis.
And go ahead, John.
Oh, I was just going to add to that, you know, it'll remain to be seen, but there are just so many ancillary companies, like big ones, including big insurers, for example. Like, another thing that happens to cannabis, right, is you have to pay, you know, your left leg and your firstborn child for insurance right now because there's like 2 people willing to do it and they're going to charge you for that privilege. We're wondering, I mean, there should be a lot of these people that are fence sitting, and is 3 going to be enough? It should be enough for at least a number of them, right? So more people will come in, the prices will go down. It's all kind of related to that stigma too, right? And that show me moment that John was talking about. But you know, that can happen with so many industries, banks, big marketing companies, all these things that might be able to help cannabis companies become more efficient, are going to all of a sudden open up and be open for business. And that's just going to be another benefit to you guys.
Wonderful. So we have a number of questions here. Let's, Nick, do you want to ask your question about transportation?
Yeah, I think you guys covered a lot of it with just breaking down some of the things to think about for like the traditional tax deductions. But I was curious if anything comes to mind specifically around just transportation. A lot of our customers that we work with are third-party transporters. So they're not buying or selling any of the product, but they still can't write off any of their business expenses because they are plant touching. So I actually see 280E being a massive win for the transport aspect of the industry because of all the vehicle maintenance miles that you can now write off. And just love to get your guys' opinion on that.
Yeah, I think that's right. I mean, I think it's dead on. I mean, the problem has been like anybody who's associated with plant touching, is problematic. I mean, it's a little easier on the cultivation side. I mean, Joanne could probably explain the distinction there, but it is actually the transacting of it, which transporters get caught up in. Certainly from a 280 perspective, but yeah, that goes away. I mean, you look at Illinois' transporter program. I don't know how you can be profitable and be a transporter in Illinois. It's impossible, right? We've at Cresco have worked with some social equity transporters, trying, but like, listen, last mile delivery, as tough as it is, when you can't deduct any of your expenses, it's impossible. Like, and the worst part about all this is we give out these licenses, you give some hope, and it's false hope because of this stuff, right? So hopefully this allows us all, gives everybody a chance to take a breath, to put a little more money back in their business, and to make a living at this, which has been exceedingly tough. But I think it will open up that world for transporters too.
Yeah,
Awesome.
Nick, to that point too, I mean, we haven't even mentioned it, but states could look at their laws again, right? Because state laws were written for protecting everyone from the Schedule I drug and make sure that it was super tightly controlled, right? Including all those manifests and all those requirements. There's a lot of companies like Lantern. I don't know if any of you guys had heard of Lantern. They were a cannabis delivery company that they just couldn't maintain, like they couldn't run a profitable business because they had to have like each person had to have a body cam and they needed to have cameras inside and outside and lux, and like they couldn't make stocks. Like it's just ridiculous, the requirements for transport. And that goes through the whole system, right? Like one thing I always love to say is, do you really need a Schedule I plant, a Schedule I vault for cannabis, right? These vaults are like, what is it, John? Like $80,000 to put in one of these safes to house a plant that people grow in their backyards. Like it's just so ridiculous. So there could also kind of more longer term also be positive effects with states being able to go relook at their laws. Does it really need to be this strict? Do we really need to do all of this crap? Maybe we can do it a little easier. And that too, of course, will make things a lot easier. And I think transport is a really good example because in Illinois, they can't warehouse it, which is like, how you make money as a transporter is if you can like run logistics and like hold some in a warehouse, So like, I would love to see that in Illinois for a change where transporters can warehouse and become more like true distributors. I think that would be great.
Yeah, that's a great call. And just what we're seeing on the front lines out here in Colorado has been interesting because on the business to business side for product transportation, you can throw 100 pounds of weed in the back of your Subaru and as an assistant manager, just drive it down to the retail store. But as a social equity delivery company, you have to have cameras, lock boxes, no cash payment. So it's like insane for way less volume. There's way more security. And specifically for those social equity license. So I hope you're right. We've seen a little bit of the opposite here in Colorado. They've actually added enforcement. We've also seen that on just West Coast versus East Coast, a lot more stringent vehicle requirements. So we'll keep an eye on that as well. But thank you. I appreciate that.
Tim, you have a question about the political whims and how rescheduling might be affected?
Just curious, how entrenched that decision will be if it is rescheduled, meaning that obviously a new administration come in, could be much more conservative. Obviously, a lot of the conservative population in the U.S. is not behind this issue at all. So once it happens, or if it happens, how difficult would it be to reverse, and what would the process be? Or do you feel that once that is kind of in place, it's difficult to reverse, despite public opinion and the massive amount of revenue that's at stake in so many states?
I'm gonna let Joanne go first on that one.
Yeah, so first of all, it's most conservatives are pro-cannabis now, actually. It's something like 90% of Americans polled are pro-medical cannabis, and I think it's a little lower, but it's like 67% of the US population is pro even rec cannabis, right? So in terms of like the culture wars have already been won, right? Now, in terms of rescheduling, I think there's two answers to it, right? One is we already have this HHS opinion, right? So it'd be really difficult, not impossible, since like I said, they just did it recently, but for the HHS to do an absolute reversal, they'd have to, I guess, find new evidence about it being dangerous, or all the studies that show some medical benefit would have to prove to have been wrong, or all of that for the HHS to change its opinion. DEA is much more flexible and could change in theory. And then, of course, I think the biggest thing is that the legislature always has the right to just change the schedule, right? They can just do that legislatively. So not impossible, I would say, but I would still say highly unlikely. I always like to say cannabis reform is like a snowball rolling down the hill, right? We don't know when it's going to get to the bottom, but it's going to get to the bottom, and it's hard to fight that momentum. So I would think it'd be highly unlikely for, if we do get to rescheduling, and because of the process I just told you guys earlier, right? Like, if anything, there's potentially going to be that administrative hearing, and there might be a lot of fighting at that point. But once the DEA final decision comes out and it gets rescheduled to Schedule 3, I would say it'd be very, very difficult, unless a lot of kids start dying or something, for cannabis to go back. And I don't think it would go back to 1. If anything, maybe it would go back up to 2. And I mean, the big fear right now even would be that the DEA is just going to put it in 2 right now, right? And if it goes to 2 right now, I'd say it'd be pretty hard to get it down to 3 or something other than by legislation, right? Then you'd be banking on a legislative strategy to get Congress to just deschedule it completely, most likely. But yeah, I think not impossible, but highly unlikely that it would go backwards.
Yeah, I mean, once the government gives something, they rarely take it away. I mean, it's just hard, right? It's hard to get the votes to take something away like that. You could see, and plus, I mean, to Joanne's point, the polling numbers are ridiculous on the other side. It's just the federal government, especially the United States Senate, moves so slow, right? I mean, those, to get 60 votes on anything is almost impossible, as we're seeing as it plays out right now, right? There's still, I don't know, 20 guys in the United States Senate that are probably over the age of 78 that hate cannabis. These are also the same guys that voted for the Farm Bill that has legalized cannabis in every gas station throughout the country, which is another conversation we can have, and I have with them frequently. So it's absurd, but yeah, I mean, listen, I think if we get to Schedule 3, highly unlikely that there would be you would need a president that was pretty aggressive against cannabis, in the face of polls that, in 40 states that have some version of legalized cannabis. Not like it's just, the politics of it wouldn't make sense. That said, throw a Ted Cruz or somebody like that in the White House, you never know what you're going to get. So I'll just, listen, everybody in the Trump world that I know or I've talked to says he's probably more liberal on Schedule 3. He's going to be fine with it. It's not going to be something that, it's not day one, right? He's got walls to build or whatever the hell else he talks about on a regular basis. So I'm confident that if we can get this done during the Biden administration, that it will stay in effect and hopefully get better. I mean, like I said, I think there's a lot of congressional traction around, like, oh, if it's Schedule 3 and it's not that dangerous, not as dangerous as heroin and cocaine, maybe we can do something. So I think it creates more momentum. And look, I mean, the House has passed the MORE Act, I don't know, a couple times, right? Full legalization. It's just we somehow need a generational turnover in the United States Senate. We need it's probably another 8 years, to be honest with you, before we see any real. I hope it's not that long. I can't take it. But yeah, I mean, I could give you a list of senators we need to get unelected or need them to retire. And then we probably get there.
Life is like,
I mean, yeah, there's bad things that are happening too, though. Like, I mean, like, and I talked a little bit flippantly about the D8 intoxicating hemp world, but I mean, honestly, people are dying. And it's not like politicians make distinctions between, oh, what is it's a cannabinoid, right? That's all they think, right? They think it's us that's killing people. Like I'm out here every day, right? Or that are getting kids sick or selling underage or doing marketing that's attractive to children. They think it's the regulated cannabis industry that's doing that, right? So call your politicians, make sure they know it's not us, right? Because the more that gets traction, the more kids get their hands on stuff at gas stations, the more kids that get sick and go to the hospital and get their teachers sick with things that look like Oreos, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. It makes our lives much tougher. Much tougher. So if you hear about people trying to regulate D8 and if you're on the hemp side or not, like, I don't care. Like, if you don't put guardrails around this, we're all going to lose. It's all going to go away, right? Because they will overreact the other way. People start dying. They start getting worked up. They're not only going to come after, they don't understand intoxicating hemp. They don't understand 0.3% THC. What they understand is it's weed. And either it's good or it's too binary for them. So we just got to be really aggressive in our messaging. The regulated industry is different from that nonsense. Anyway, I'll get off. That's not today's topic. So I'm sorry, Brad, for going down a rabbit hole.
I'll get it. No, we're going to get into that a little bit on Friday and next month. We're going to constantly address this in person. So we would welcome, more of your contribution, particularly on that area, and maybe have a little bit of debate over what the guardrails should be and how we should have the same regulatory regime for everything. We should all have, at the very least, an equal playing field.
I've got a dirty little secret I like to tell politicians. It's the same plant.
Yeah.
What are we talking about? How are there two different regulatory structures for the same plant? It's absurd, right? Of course it should all be regulated in the same way, right? I mean, and the synthetic stuff is really problematic. I mean, it's bath salts. It's getting bad. I mean, 3 people died in Cook County Jail this year from intoxicating hemp. 3. It's coming and it's getting worse. Yeah. So anyway, sorry, I'll start pontificating at my.
No. This is why we're here. Conrad, you have a question about Georgia?
Yeah, I'm not sure if you guys have seen or are familiar with anything that was happening in Georgia in regards to kind of the pharmacy model that they were looking to roll out. But yeah, kind of a couple of weeks before, some pharmacies were looking to start the sale of low THC percentage products in a very strict line. They got that letter saying pretty much cease and desist, and it's still at a standstill because of descheduling, which is pretty much around everything you guys were talking about earlier, around why they said they can't operate.
We have a few clients that are Georgia licensees, so I've been tracking this really closely and carefully, and I'm really excited about it. It's a very legally dorky answer, but there's a really good argument that what the DEA did is totally illegal under the spending bill. Like, they cannot do that. Even the fact that they wrote that letter, they violated federal law when they did that, because they're not supposed to be expending resources to impede medical cannabis programs. And the HOPE Act is a medical cannabis program, and telling pharmacies that they cannot dispense it without losing their DEA registration is a chilling act that impedes the HOPE Act. So actually, we've been trying through our relationship with our clients to convince the state of Georgia to sue the DEA on the basis that that letter was illegal and that they're not allowed to.
I'll say, who are you talking? You're working with the current operator in Georgia, you said?
Yeah, we work with some of the current operators. So, the big question, right, is like, who's going to sue, right? So, and who has standing to sue? So
Yeah.
All of that is kind of very technical legal stuff, but the short answer is that's a really interesting kind of forefront of cannabis law in the US right now. We're trying to convince the state to sue because they're one of the few people that can sue. The other option would be a brave independent pharmacist or some sort of association of pharmacists is what we would need. So we're kind of in the active hunt for a good litigation plaintiff to kind of go challenge that, because that is, I think it's a
Have you
really big
talked to
case
either,
that the
like-
DA should not be able to do what they did and they should get slapped for it.
Have you talked to like Truvana and Botanical Sciences yet? Because they're the two licensed operators besides the pharmacies.
One of them is my client, and the other one I am familiar with, but have not
So
spoken.
yeah, one of them's ours. We had to shut down like 115 pharmacies 2 weeks before the end of the month that we were fully slated. They had stuff on pallets and stuff. We already had their point of sales turned on. And then we had it was so I'd love to help sync you up with our client as well.
If any of your collaborators want to sue, yeah, you should definitely.
Well, they have,
email me.
I would say they have a bunch of independent pharmacies that they've gone out and secured contracts for. So like, they would be a good contact to get a holistic kind of opinion from a bunch of the pharmacies, or I would love to sync you up with them. Maybe we can sync up after this and kind of just chat on Georgia specifically. But yeah.
Absolutely, please. We've been, I would love to be part of that litigation. Again, like I said, it's kind of nerdy, but it's like they are not allowed to do that, and they shouldn't be allowed
It
to.
was quite awful.
Things happen. I'll make sure that Flourish and Dentons are connected after this phone call, and I love seeing that happen. Ray, we have a potpourri or potpourri of questions here related to anti-cannabis lobby. Go ahead.
No, this is just more, over a probably more over an evening of just hanging out. There's a bigger conversation, but just the people who are against a lot of this stuff, I think, especially, I was really surprised when I saw like prison unions were fighting legalization because, they were going to lose prisoners, right? And if they let people out, and that's going to be an issue. So when I look at even at the DEA, and you look at the volume of staff that are fighting, the drug war, so to speak, it just seems that there'll still be, look, if we give them some assurance that they're not going to lose their federal employee status and we're just going to put them in a different vertical, I'm just wondering how much of that is that's got to be talked about in DC, right? That has to be a conversation that people are concerned that if we start rescheduling this stuff, similar, we're not going to go to a flat tax because the accountants are going to lobby to make sure that that's just not something that happens. Everyone's got their interested lobby group, but in this space in particular, it seems interesting. And to your point, about the synthetics and these other issues, what I don't understand is how the conversation at the higher level, especially looking at the healthcare and well-being of the country, if we get some national standard, then I know that if I buy something in Georgia or LA or in Boston or wherever, and it's been approved to meet a certain chemical consistency, if I buy Advil, I'm not worried about what the makeup is, right? Wherever I buy it. We're not getting that now, right? So people who are literally medically needing this to take care of themselves, it's such an inconsistent product. Even in the same marketplace, over time, it just, how is that not part of the conversation? So again, much more here, and I don't expect to answer this. I just am just curious, need your kind of feedback on any of that stuff.
Yeah, listen, just broad brushstrokes. First I'll say is government doesn't make sense, right? You think common sense arguments work with politicians? They rarely do, right? There's got to be some hook, some self-interest, some reason why it's going to help them either with their election or their constituency. And a lot of both, typically. So it's hard, but I would say and that's what makes safe banking so hard, right, guys? I don't want to promote cannabis. I might be okay with cannabis being legal, but I don't want to promote businesses. I don't want youth to get at like all of that, right? Like they don't want to promote cannabis businesses, but maybe they're okay with not putting people in jail, which, whether or not that makes sense, is another story. So it's tough, but I will say, you made a great point at the top of that with the DEA. So what happens, right? Joe Biden comes in, he appoints an administrator from the DEA and a couple other political appointments that go over there to try and manage the DEA, right? And Joe Biden, I give him credit for this, is very hesitant. The White House is very hesitant to ever talk to the Justice Department, right? They just don't want to have that, you hear the Trumpian world talking about, oh, I'm going to make the Attorney General go and arrest all my political opponents and throw them in jail and all that nonsense, right? Joe Biden goes the other way. Like They don't even like to call the Justice Department. It's like, you guys go do your thing, we do ours, and never the two shall meet. Now, there are some political things that do happen, and this is one of those, right? So you've got Ann Milgram running the DEA. She's a political appointee. I'm confident that Ann Milgram wants to see Schedule 3 happen. Confident. But she has an entire bureaucracy over there of career DEA officials that have been working to put people in jail for cannabis for the last 40 years, right? So those guys who actually have to write this stuff are not real enthusiastic about putting down on paper that what they've done for the last 40 years was bullshit, which we all know it was, right? So they are now, so she's pushing them to draft something that is politically palatable to the White House that she can release to say Schedule 3, and they're writing shit like all children are going to die, right? I mean, that's, I mean, I'm oversimplifying, but that's the battle that's going on in DEA. And Joanne brought it up, like they're a little past where they normally would be, 3 months on something like this. They're at 6 or 5 or whatever, but it's because that's happening internally. But I will say the flip side of that coin is it is not politically palatable for this White House. I can't imagine a world where they come out and they're like, okay, we're cool with DEA saying Schedule 2 and cannabis is actually fentanyl. Like they will look like idiots if they do that, right? Now, and listen, a lot of politicians look like idiots all the time, but I'm confident in the conversation I'm had with the White House that they are well aware that that would be catastrophic, especially when it comes to young people throughout this country supporting this. And he needs young voters, he needs minority voters to have some enthusiasm. And the school, paying back student loans thing blew up. Like, even though it was the Supreme Court, he still gets blamed for not getting his promise across the finish line, right? If he doesn't do something on this and a few other things, like he's in trouble. So I think likely the political side of this wins, but it's a great point. There is a huge part of the DA that doesn't want it to happen because they want to keep putting people in jail for cannabis. And, so it's a great point though.
So we just have a couple minutes left. On the way out, we said we might hear about rescheduling, hopefully in the next couple of weeks. Is there any chance that we're going to hear a positive outcome on safer banking in this congressional term?
So I'll say 2 things. If I was a betting man, and I am, I would take the over/under on the scheduling announcement as before the State of the Union, which is March 7th. I would not. If I was the president of the United States, I would want to be able to go in and talk to young people about how we've rescheduled or in the process of rescheduling or something, right? So that is not based on any conversation I've had. That's just me thinking, reading tea leaves and putting it out there. Safe banking is so close. And I hesitate to say this because we were so close in December of last year. The House is a mess. I don't, but the best part about the mess is that they have to work with Democrats to pass anything. So Democrats are going to get some priorities. And we have, God bless Senator Sinema, who is leading the safe banking negotiations in both the House and the Senate. She was on financial services as a member of the House. She is independent as they come. She kicks ass. I can't talk about her highly enough as far as brokering deals in the Senate and the House, and she's the one that's leading it right now. So I think there's a really good opportunity. We get something here between now and March, maybe attached to the FAA bill or FISA, unlikely FISA, but FAA or one of these mini funding bills that are coming through. So, God, if we got both, what an industry we'd have, huh? Be a great day in America. But I'll take one or the other. We just can't strike out again between now and June. So let's hope. Keep hope alive.
Joanne.
Yeah, basically same kind of rumors. I'm hearing we'll hear something at least about rescheduling by 4/20, which is like the stupidest thing I've ever heard, but they just love to be cute for some reason. So by 4/20, I like John's May 7 guess. And then I had previously heard like January 20, right? We're on January 23, so that was wrong. And then for safer, we're hearing first half of the year, maybe it can get done. If it goes much past that, I don't know. The other big thing I've heard for safer is that we got to get the HOPE Act passed with it. that's kind of coming from the social equity side of the industry. They really want Hope to pass with it, and Booker and Warnock are probably going to require it too. So that, and potentially that gun rights law as a package, seems to be the most likely way SAFER will pass.
Well, I want to thank you so much, both John Sullivan, Joanna Caceres, for being on our panel. Round of applause. Thank you so much. You can hear it through the mute. And stay tuned for later today. Gabby will be moderating a panel on the future of ag tech. And we're going to have much more on the rescheduling and safer banking on Thursday when we do a panel on elections with Jay Rosenthal from Cultivate News, Katie Neer from the New York Medical Association, and John Pletz from Crane's Chicago Business. John, Joanne, thank you so much. Everyone else, we'll see you in a few hours.
Thank you all.
Everyone, nice
Thank you
meeting
very
you.
much. Great
Thank
insight.
you.